CSS Grid is an absolutely incredible way of easily creating custom layouts for your web page. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at everything you need to know to create custom layouts using CSS Grid. So Grid works very similar to Flexbox, where it works on a parent-child relationship basis. So you will define the grid on the parent element, and it's going to define exactly how the child elements are laid out. So here I've got a div with a class of grid on it, and then inside of that I have a few child elements with the class of child on them. And then over here in the CSS, I've just got that child class defined with a standard height and a width and a background color. So let's go ahead and define our first grid. So we're going to select that parent element with the grid class. So we're going to select grid, and then we're just going to display grid. And we'll save that. And you'll notice that nothing has actually changed, and the reason for that is because we've defined that it's supposed to be a grid layout, but we haven't actually added any kind of definition of how the grid should be laid out. And one of the easiest ways to define how a grid should be laid out is by using the grid template column and grid template rows. Now remember, grid works exactly like a table, or very similar to a table, where it works with both columns and rows. So we can define how the columns are laid out, and we can define how the rows are laid out. So let's go ahead and start with our columns first. So to define our columns, we're going to use the grid template columns, just like that. And this is going to define how wide each one of our columns are, and it's also going to define how many columns that we're going to have. So let's say we want to start out with 3 separate columns. So we need to pass in 3 separate values. So let's say our first column is going to be 100 pixels wide. And then our second column is going to be 200 pixels wide, and we'll make the third column 100 pixels wide as well. So we need to pass in 3 separate values here. We need to pass in 100 pixels for our first column, we need to pass in 200 pixels for our second column, and we need to pass in another 100 pixels for our third column. And if we save that, you can see that we now have 3 separate columns. The first column, which is 100 pixels, the second column, which is 200 pixels, and this third column, it is 100 pixels as well. So now that we've got our columns laid out, we can now work on defining our rows. So if you've noticed this layout, we've got 3 separate rows. So we'll go ahead and stick with that, and we'll just keep 3 separate rows. So let's just define our 3 rows now. So to define our 3 rows, we're going to use a similar one called grid template rows, and this is going to define how high our rows are going to be and how our rows are going to lay out. So let's just say we want to make a 75 pixel first row that's going to be 75 pixels high, and then let's do 150 pixels on our second row, and let's do 100 pixels on our third row. And you can see that they've automatically laid out for us. So this row right here, this very first row, is 75 pixels high. Now the second row here, it's going to be 150 pixels high, and this third row is 100 pixels high. And this is the basic layout. This is the basic way that we can create layouts using CSS Grid. So if you remember from my Flexbox video linked up in the cards, we talked about gap. And gap was a way of adding a little bit of space in between each one of the elements. Well, Grid allows us to also add gap, but it gives us a little bit more flexibility with it as well. We can add column gap, or we can add row gap, or we can add gap to all of it. So to add some gap, let's say we wanted to add a little bit of row gap underneath of each one of these rows. All we would have to do is say row gap, and we could define how much space of gap we want in between each one of the rows. So let's say we want 5 pixels of gap in between each one of the rows. So it's going to set 5 pixels in between each one of these rows, and that's going to be considered whenever it's included in the layout. So each one of these is still going to be the same size that you've defined. It's just going to add a little bit of gap in between each one of the rows. And we can also do the same for the column. So we could set column gap, and let's say we want to add 20 pixels of column gap, and it's going to add 20 pixels of gap in between each one of the columns. And there's actually a third property, and this is the standard gap property. And the standard gap property is going to work in between both the columns and the rows. So it's going to define the same number, the same value in between each one of the columns and the rows. And if I define this underneath, if this is the last one that is defined, it's going to overwrite the row and the gap column properties. So just like a color, if you define a text color of red and then later on you define a text color of blue, it's going to override that text color of red and it's going to apply that color of blue. It's the last one that was defined. So this gap property works as both the column and the row gap property. So it's going to overwrite both of those if those are applied. So let's go ahead and define our gap. So if we define 50 pixels of gap in between each one of these rows and these columns, we're going to have 50 pixels in between each one of these columns and these rows. And just remember, the gap is the spacing between each one of the elements. It does not take up space from the elements. It's its own separate spacing. So this next one here, this is exactly why Grid is considered one of the best layout tools for CSS. And the reason for it is because we can define names and we can just lay things out however we want. So let me show you exactly how it works. So I've got a display grid div, and then I've got 4 items inside of it. I've got a header, a nav, a main, and then a footer tag as well. And this is just a normal website layout. You would normally see these types of things on a website. So let's just go ahead and lay these things out. First thing we need to do is we need to give these things names. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use the grid area. So grid area will define a name, and then we can use grid template area to define where those things are laid out at. So let's just go ahead and give these names. We'll select the header, and we're going to give this a grid area of head. And you can just define head just like that. And then we're going to use that head name to distinguish which one is which. So let's go ahead and give the nav, select the nav, and we're going to give the nav a grid area of nav. And then we're going to select the main, and we're going to give this a grid area of main. And then we'll select the footer, and we'll give this a grid area of foot. And this is the basis of it. So now on the parent element, we can actually lay this out using grid template area. So let's just define our grid template areas, and this works by doing strings. So we're actually going to set this up like this. We're going to use double quotation marks, and then we're going to define our individual rows and columns. So just like this, we're going to select the head, which is this header right here. And then we can put a space, and we can do another head. And then we can put a space, and we can do another head. And then we're going to go down a level to our next one, which is going to consider our next row. So after that, we can do a nav, and then we can do a main, and we can do another main. So the nav is going to link up with this nav here, and then the main is going to link up with this main because we've defined these names on these grid areas. And then we'll select a third row, and we'll just go ahead and give the nav here as well. And then we'll do a footer by giving it foot, and we'll give another foot to give it a footer as well. And I don't know why this none was automatically added in, but we need to get rid of it. So whenever I save now, you can actually see that this over here looks exactly as we've laid it out here. And this is why CSS Grid is so powerful and allows you to lay things out however you want to. And this is actually very flexible. So let's add another head here. And if we save that, you can see everything is screwed up. And that's because we don't have a perfect square. So we've got 4 columns here, and we've only defined 3 here and 3 here. So we need to define something for that 4th column. So let's actually just add another main here, and then I don't want that footer to span the entire width of the main. I just want it to leave it blank space if we could. How do we do that? Well, to leave a blank space in something like this, all we'd have to do is just put a period, just like that. And if I save that now, you can see that the layout is exactly the same, but it's expanded 1 more column, and this footer here is short 1 extra column as well. And that's because we added that period there, which basically signifies that this should be a blank space. But this isn't as flexible as you might think, because I can't just go ahead and add a random blank space in the middle of the main. That's just going to completely break everything. You're not going to be able to do that with regular grid. You can't do that here. You have to have everything side by side. Everything has to be laid out in a box shape of some kind. But this is still an extremely powerful tool, and you can use this for laying out just about any website that you can think of. So in CSS Grid, you can actually define where things are going to start and where things are going to end in both the columns and the rows. So here I've got a div with a class of grid, and then I've got about 5 child elements inside of it. And we're going to work with this box1 class, and this is going to be this very first one right here. And we're going to give this a grid column start, and this is going to define where this first one, which column this first one is going to start at. So if we pass in a 2 here, you can see that it starts on the 2nd column, and we can actually pass in an end as well. So if we say grid column end, we can actually define how many rows it's going to span. So if we start it at 2, we can end it at something like 5. And this is going to span now from column 2, 3, and 4, and it's going to end right before column 5 starts. And if we wanted to extend it a little bit further, let's work with this box 2 now. And we'll give this a grid column start. And let's say we just want to start this at column 2 as well. And let's say we want this to span, I don't know, 7 columns. So we'll give it a grid column end of 7. And now this is going to extend from column 2 all the way through column 6 right before column 7 starts. And we can actually do the same thing with rows as well. So if we wanted to set the grid row start at 2, because this is currently on row 2, and we could set the grid row end at column 5. Now this is going to extend from column 2 all the way to column 7, excluding the last one, so it's going to be column 2 through the end of column 6, and then this is going to extend downwards 3 rows. So it's going to start at 2, and it's going to extend down through row 3 and through row 4 right before row 5 would start. Now we actually have a shorthand property for this as well. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And to use this shorthand property, it's pretty straightforward. All we have to do is define grid column or grid row, whichever one you want, and we can start it and end it on the same exact line. So if I wanted to basically do this exact same thing I did up here, all I'd have to do is say we start at 2, and then we're going to put a slash, and this is going to say this is where the first one starts, and then the next one is where it's going to end. So if we put a 5 here, it's going to be the equivalent of this up here, and these and this are both the exact same thing. And just like with all the other ones, the grid column start and grid column end, we can do this with just about any one of them. So we can have this start at column 1, and we can have this end at column 10. So this will extend from the first column all the way through the end of the 9th column before the beginning of the 10th column. And we can do this with rows as well. So grid row, we could start it at row 2 because we are currently on row 2. And we could extend this all the way through row 6, just like that. Now we've got grid column that's expanding 10 columns, and we've got grid row that's spanning 2 through 5. Now I've gone ahead and changed this so that it's just starting at 2 rather than at 1. And you may have noticed this before, but these ones that are here, these used to be down here. I mean, this is only box 2, this real big one. So why is 3, 4, and 5 above box 2? Shouldn't it be down here below box 2? Well, this is happening because of the grid autoflow. And what this basically is that smaller ones are taking up smaller spaces where they can fit. So it's kind of like a wrap almost for grid. And we can actually change this as well. So we could change the grid, and this is going to apply to the parent element. We can change the grid auto flow, and by default this is going to be row. So we could have a column, row, or dense here, or we could have a column dense or row dense. So by default it's going to default to row, but if we wanted it to take up the column space instead, we could just change this to column, and now it's going to take up all of the extra column space. And we could actually have column dense here as well, and it's not going to change anything in this layout. But what dense does basically is that it goes back and it backtracks and finds smaller spaces that it can fit into to fill up things. So if I had a really small sliver or whatever, it would have filled up a small space here or wherever, anywhere that it can find enough space that still follows the layout of it. So we can have that column, or by default is going to be row. So this one starts at column 2. So these are going to just follow along in that row right there. But if we changed it to row dense, now you can see that it's still following the row, but it's gone back and filled up this small space that's in the very first slot because there's enough space for this to fill there. Now there's one more thing that I want to take a look at, and that's going to be the repeat function. Now the repeat function is a very useful utility that allows us to repeat something or some action. So the way that we're going to apply it is with the grid template column or the grid template row. So we're going to apply grid template column, and then we can apply the repeat function. So the repeat function is just going to repeat however many times, and you're going to specify the size. So let's say we want to repeat this 3 times, and we're going to pass in a 3, and then we're going to comma separate it, and then we're going to say each one of those should be 100 pixels. And now you can see that the columns are being repeated 3 identical times with 100 pixels in width for those columns. And we can actually add more to this as well. Being the grid template columns, we can actually add more repeat functions, or we could add another column if we want. So we could have a 4th column at the end that's only 50 pixels. And now we've got 4 columns, 3 of which are being repeated, and this one who is only 50 pixels in width. And we can also do another repeat if we want, and we could say repeat this twice with 200 pixels. Now you can see that we've got this exact thing. So we've got our 3 repeating columns at the beginning, and then we've got our 50 pixel column here, and then we've got our 2 repeating 200 pixel columns. And this is just repeating just because this is grid, and it's going to continue following this pattern all the way until there's no more child elements. And that is CSS grid. It's a very simple concept, and once you understand fully how it works, you'll be using it all the time time in your layouts. But this video was packed densely with different things and different concepts, so if you had trouble with anything, go back and rewatch the video. Make sure you understand it as best as you can. If you have any questions, make sure you post them down in the comments. I'll answer as many questions as I can. If you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist, link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.